The morning sun cast long shadows across the fields as Robert Caldwell stepped onto his front porch, coffee mug in hand. The familiar weight of it warmed his calloused palms, hands that had worked this 50-acre ranch for nearly 20 years. He breathed in deeply, savoring the scent of fresh hay and distant pine that had greeted him every morning since he'd bought this slice of heaven. Things had changed over the last few years. The open fields that once stretched beyond his eastern border were now dotted with cookie-cutter houses, all painted in various shades of beige and gray. The Sycamore Hills neighborhood had sprung up practically overnight, bringing with it paved roads, streetlights, and a homeowners association that seemed to have more rules than the state legislature. Robert didn't mind them much. He waved at the morning joggers when they passed near his property line. He even attended the neighborhood welcome barbecue they'd hosted 3 years ago, when the development first broke ground. But mostly, he kept to himself, tending to his horses and small herd of cattle, while the new folks went about their suburban lives with their manicured lawns and community pool socials. Time to check the east field, he muttered to himself, draining the last of his coffee. He needed to move some equipment through the eastern access road, the quickest route to his back pasture where a section of fence needed mending. Robert climbed into his weathered blue pickup truck, the engine rumbling to life with a familiar growl. The truck had seen better days, but like everything on his ranch, it was well-maintained and reliable. He followed the dirt path that wound through his property toward the eastern access point, a simple dirt road he'd used for almost 2 decades. As he rounded the final bend, Robert slammed on his brakes, the truck skidding slightly in the loose gravel. What in the world? Where the open access road should have been, a tall steel gate now stood, freshly installed and padlocked. The metal gleamed in the morning sun, almost mockingly. A large red and white sign hung from the center. Private property, Sycamore Hills, HOA, no trespassing. Robert sat in his idling truck staring at the barrier in disbelief. No one had said a word to him. No letter, no phone call, no neighborly knock on his door. Nothing. He put the truck in park and stepped out, boots crunching on the gravel as he approached the gate. It was solid steel construction, not some temporary measure. This had been planned, prepared for, and executed without a single word to him. "You've got to be kidding me," he said to no one in particular, running his hand along the cold metal. Back at his house, Robert dialed the number printed at the bottom of the HOA sign. After 3 rings, a woman's voice answered with practiced cheerfulness. "Sycamore Hills Homeowners Association, this is Patricia. How may I help you?" "This is Robert Caldwell. Someone's put up a gate blocking my eastern access road. I need to speak to whoever's in charge." After a brief hold and some too cheerful waiting music, a different voice came on the line. "Mr. Caldwell, this is Marjorie Whitfield, president of the Sycamore Hills Board. I understand you're calling about the new security measures we've implemented." Robert paced his kitchen, phone pressed to his ear. "Security measures? That road has been my access point for nearly 20 years. You can't just block it off without any warning." "I understand your frustration," Marjorie replied, her voice smooth as polished marble and just as cold. "However, our recent land survey clearly shows that access road falls within Sycamore Hills property lines. The board voted unanimously to secure our perimeter for safety and liability reasons. I've been using that road since before your neighborhood even existed," Robert explained, struggling to keep his voice level. "There's got to be some mistake." "Perhaps so, Mr. Caldwell, but our documentation clearly shows it belongs to the association. You'll need to use your main entrance on the west side from now on." Robert pinched the bridge of his nose, feeling a headache coming on. "The west entrance crosses Miller Creek. It floods every spring. I can't move my cattle or equipment through there for weeks when the water's high." "I'm afraid that's not the association's concern," Marjorie replied. "The property lines are quite clear." After a few more minutes of circular conversation, Robert hung up the phone, his frustration building like a summer storm. He walked to his back porch and looked out over his land, trying to make sense of this new problem. That's when he noticed something he'd never paid much attention to before. In the distance, near the southwest corner of his property, a narrow dirt road cut across a small section of what he thought was his land. A convoy of landscaping trucks was using it now, kicking, up dust as they ferried workers and equipment into the Sycamore Hills community. Robert watched them for a long moment, wheels turning in his mind. He remembered when he'd bought this place. There had been some odd property line quirks, a small parcel that didn't quite connect right at that corner. He'd never bothered much with it since no one used that old dirt path. Until now, apparently. Now it was the HOA's service entrance for maintenance vehicles. Robert's lips curved into the hint of a smile. He walked inside to his office and pulled out the original property maps from when he'd purchased the ranch. It was time to check exactly where those property lines ran. Two can play at this game, he said quietly, unfolding the faded documents across his desk. A plan was taking shape, one that might just teach the Sycamore Hills HOA a lesson about being good neighbors. The old maps spread across Robert's kitchen table told an interesting story. Yellow with age and marked with faded pencil notes, they showed property boundaries from when he'd first bought the ranch. Robert traced his finger along the southwestern border where the service road cut through. Sure enough, there was a small half-acre parcel that wasn't included in his original purchase. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, reaching for his reading glasses to get a better look at the faded name on that parcel. Westlake Development Group. The next morning, Robert drove into town. The bell above the door jingled as he entered the law office of Tom Henderson, who had handled his property purchase all those years ago. The office smelled of old books and coffee, with wood paneling that hadn't been updated since the 1980s. Robert Caldwell. "Haven't seen you in a while," Tom said, rising from behind his cluttered desk to shake Robert's hand. His white hair was thinner than Robert remembered, but his grip was still firm. "What brings you in today? Not selling the ranch, I hope?" Robert settled into the worn leather chair across from Tom. "Not selling, but I might be buying. Got a situation with that new development next door." For the next half hour, Robert explained about the gate, the blocked access road, and his discovery about the service road cutting through land he didn't own. Tom listened, occasionally jotting notes on a yellow legal pad. "So what I'm wondering," Robert concluded, "is who owns that small parcel now and whether I might be able to purchase it." Tom leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against his notepad. Westlake Development went bankrupt during the housing crash. Their assets were divided up among creditors. I'd need to do some digging to find out who holds that parcel now. "I'd appreciate that," Robert said. "And Tom, I'd prefer to keep this quiet. No need for the HOA to know what I'm up to." Tom's eyes twinkled. "Client confidentiality, Robert. I haven't stayed in business 40 years by wagging my tongue." Over the next few weeks, Robert went about his daily routine. He found a longer route, to his back pasture, adding almost 30 minutes to the trip. It was inconvenient, but he didn't complain. When he saw HOA maintenance trucks using the service road, he'd wave politely, sometimes even stopping to chat with the workers about the weather. "Lovely community you've got there," he'd say, gesturing toward Sycamore Hills. "Really sprucing up the area." The workers seemed surprised by his friendliness given the gate situation that had spread through town gossip. But Robert kept his true feelings hidden behind a neighborly smile. Patience had always served him well, both with livestock and with people. 3 weeks after his visit, Tom called. "Found your answer, Robert. That parcel is owned by First Horizon Bank in Arizona. They acquired it as part of a package of foreclosed properties. According to their asset manager, they've been paying property taxes on it for years without even realizing exactly what they had. Any chance they'd sell?" Robert asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Already asked. They're managing hundreds of these small parcels and would be happy to offload it. They quoted a price that's pretty reasonable considering." Robert felt a surge of hope. "How reasonable?" Tom named a figure that made Robert whistle. "That's almost nothing. They have no idea about its strategic value. To them, it's just a useless half-acre in the middle of nowhere that's costing them tax money every year. I can start the paperwork tomorrow if you want to move forward." "Let's do it," Robert said. The process took longer than Robert hoped. Banking bureaucracy moved at its own pace. Forms had to be filed, signatures gathered, checks processed. Throughout it all, Robert maintained his routine, never letting on to anyone what he was doing. When he saw Marjorie Whitfield at the grocery store one afternoon, he tipped his hat politely. "Afternoon, Ms. Whitfield." She looked surprised, then suspicious. "Mr. Caldwell, how are you managing with your alternative access route?" "Getting by just fine," Robert said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Amazing how we all adapt to changing circumstances, isn't it?" She seemed puzzled by his lack of hostility but nodded curtly before pushing her cart toward the produce section. December arrived, bringing with it cold winds and the occasional dusting of snow. Robert spent his days mending fences, tending to his livestock, and checking his mailbox for news from Tom. Finally, 2 days before Christmas, Tom called. "Consider it your Christmas present, Robert. The bank approved everything. The deed transfer is complete. That half-acre is officially yours." A warm satisfaction spread through Robert's chest. Any chance anyone at the county records office might mention this to someone from Sycamore Hills? Doubtful. These transactions happen all the time. Nobody pays attention unless they're specifically looking. And as requested, we kept your name off all the public paperwork by putting it under your LLC. As far as anyone knows, Mountain View Holdings just acquired a small, insignificant parcel of land. That evening, Robert drove out to look at his new purchase. To the untrained eye, it was nothing special, just a dusty stretch where the service road cut through toward Sycamore Hills. But to Robert, it was the key to teaching the HOA a valuable lesson about respecting long-established neighbors. He stood there in the fading winter light, watching a maintenance truck rumble across what was now his land, the driver giving him a casual wave as he passed. Robert waved back, smiling to himself. No new signs went up, no fences were built, no announcements were made. Robert simply had. Tom filed the deed with the county records office, making the transfer official but keeping it quiet. In the evenings, Robert sketched plans for a simple but effective gate. Nothing too fancy, just sturdy enough to make his point. He ordered the materials, storing them in his barn, out of sight from curious eyes. And then he waited, watching the winter snow gradually melt away as spring approached. The creek on his western border would soon be swollen with snowmelt, making his main entrance impassable just as calving season arrived. But this year, Robert had a plan. As he sat by his fireplace on a cold January evening, he smiled at the thought of what was to come when the Sycamore Hills HOA realized exactly what they had done and what he now owned. April arrived with a rush of color and sound. Wildflowers dotted Robert's pastures, birds returned to nest in the old oak trees, and the creek on his western border swelled with snowmelt just as he'd predicted. Spring also brought the annual landscaping overhaul for Sycamore Hills, a tradition the community took pride in, with fresh mulch, new flowers, and pruned trees transforming the neighborhood after the dull winter months. Robert rose early on the first Monday of April, made his coffee, and glanced at his calendar where he'd circled today's date in red. According to the Sycamore Hills community newsletter he'd picked up at the local diner, today was the start of their spring beautification week. He smiled into his coffee mug. Perfect timing. The gate he'd built was simple but effective. Metal. Posts sunk deep into concrete with a sturdy crossbar. Nothing fancy but unmistakably a barrier. He'd installed it 2 nights ago under the cover of darkness, positioning it directly across the service road on his newly purchased half-acre. Beside it, he'd hammered in a sign that mirrored the one they'd placed on his eastern access. Private. Property, Caldwell Ranch, access by permission only. Robert drove his truck to a small rise overlooking the service road and waited. The morning dew soaked his boots as he leaned against his truck, binoculars hanging around his neck. He didn't have to wait long. Just after 7:30, a convoy appeared. First came 2 pickup trucks carrying workers, followed by a large dump truck loaded with mulch, and behind that, a flatbed carrying saplings and landscaping equipment. They approached his new gate, dust rising behind them in the early morning light. The lead truck slowed, then stopped abruptly. The driver got out, hands on his hips, staring at the unexpected barrier. The other vehicles pulled up behind, engines idling. Robert watched through his binoculars as the drivers gathered around the gate, gesturing and passing around a cell phone. 20 minutes later, a shiny black SUV came racing down the road, stopping with a spray of gravel. Marjorie Whitfield stepped out, her pantsuit immaculate despite the early hour, her face a mask of controlled fury even from this distance. Robert took his time driving down to meet them. He parked a respectable distance away and strolled toward the group, thumbs hooked in his belt loops, the very picture of casual curiosity. "Morning, folks," he called as he approached. "Seems like we've got ourselves a bit of a traffic jam." Marjorie spun toward him. "Mr. Caldwell, what is the meaning of this?" Robert shrugged, looking at the gate as if seeing it for the first time. "Oh, that? Just securing my property line. Recent survey showed this access road crosses my land." He patted the gatepost. "Safety and liability reasons, you understand." The color rising in Marjorie's cheeks made her makeup stand out in sharp contrast. "This road has been used by the association for years. You can't just block it without notice." "Funny thing about established access," Robert said, leaning against his new gate. "I believe we had a similar conversation about my eastern entrance a few months back, though I don't recall getting any notice before that gate went up." "This is different," Marjorie insisted, lowering her voice and stepping closer. "We have over 30 homes waiting for their spring landscaping, the community pool renovation. Materials need to come through here next week. Our waste management contract—" "I'm not unreasonable," Robert interrupted, holding up his hands. "I'm happy to grant access permits." "Permits?" One of the landscape workers looked confused. "For a fee, of course." Robert reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded document. "My lawyer has drawn up the paperwork." He handed the paper to Marjorie, who snatched it from his hand. The document, professionally prepared by Tom, outlined the access terms. $75 per vehicle, per crossing, with additional fees for vehicles over certain weight limits to cover wear and tear on the private road. Marjorie's eyes widened as she read. She crumpled the paper in her fist. "This is extortion. $75 per vehicle? That's—" She did a quick calculation, looking at the line of trucks. "Hundreds of dollars just for today's work, alone. Thousands over the course of your spring renovations," Robert corrected politely. "I've seen your planning schedule in the newsletter. Quite ambitious." The landscape foreman stepped forward, looking uncomfortable. "Ms. Whitfield, we need to get these plants in the ground. They won't last long in this heat." Marjorie held up a hand to silence him without taking her eyes off Robert. "The HOA will fight this. This road has been in continuous use since before you acquired whatever paper claim you think you have." "Interesting legal argument." Robert nodded. "Established use creating an implied easement. My lawyer mentioned you might say that." He pointed
east toward the gate blocking his access. "Seems like that principle should apply to my eastern entrance too, then? The one I've been using for 20 years? Marjorie's jaw tightened. She turned to the landscape crew.
"Take the main entrance, go around." The foreman looked pained. "That'll add almost an hour to each trip with the current traffic patterns, and the big trucks might not make it through those narrow community streets." "Figure it out." Marjorie snapped. Robert just smiled. "You're welcome to use the public road and come through your main entrance. Might add a few miles to the trip, but I reckon that's what you've been telling me to do, isn't it?" Marjorie turned back to him, her voice low and dangerous. "This isn't over, Mr. Caldwell." "I expect not," Robert agreed pleasantly. "My lawyer's number is on the bottom of that paper you're crushing. Feel free to have your attorney call him any time." The convoy slowly turned around, executing awkward three-point turns in the narrow dirt road. Marjorie was the last to leave, her SUV kicking up an unnecessarily large cloud of dust as she accelerated away. Robert stayed by the gate long after they'd gone, listening to the birds and the distant lowing of his cattle. He felt no particular joy in their frustration. That wasn't the point. But there was a certain satisfaction in standing his ground, in pushing back against the assumption that progress always meant the old ways had to give way. Throughout the day, Robert watched from a distance as landscaping vehicles attempted different approaches to the community, navigating the narrow main entrance and clogging traffic. Some of the homeowners came out to watch, pointing toward his property and talking among themselves. Just before sunset, Robert's phone rang. It was Tom. "You've stirred up quite a hornet's nest," his lawyer said, amusement clear in his voice. "I've received 3 calls from the HOA attorney already. They're threatening all sorts of legal action." "Let them," Robert said, watching the sunset paint the distant houses of Sycamore Hills in golden light. "We've got the deed, we've got the survey, and we've got 20 years of me using that eastern gate. Let's see how they like playing by their own rules." Later that evening, Robert sat on his porch, a glass of iced tea sweating beside him. In the distance, he could see lights on at the Sycamore Hills Community Center. An emergency HOA meeting, no doubt. He smiled to himself, wondering just how much more expensive their spring beautification was about to become. Word spread quickly through Sycamore Hills. By Tuesday morning, Robert's phone was ringing off the hook with calls from local reporters seeking comment on what the county newspaper had dubbed the Great Gate Debate. Robert politely declined to say much, offering only that he was protecting his property rights just like any landowner would. That evening, the Sycamore Hills Community Center parking lot overflowed with cars. Robert didn't need to attend the emergency HOA meeting to know it would be the most crowded in the neighborhood's history. From his kitchen window, he could see people streaming into the single-story brick building, some gesturing animatedly as they walked. Hank Williams, who owned the hardware store in town and whose cousin lived in Sycamore Hills, called Robert the next morning. "You've sure stirred up a hornet's nest, Bobby," Hank chuckled through the phone. "My cousin says that meeting last night nearly came to blows. Never seen so many people worked up over a dirt road." "What are they planning?" Robert asked, genuinely curious. "3 options from what I hear. Pay your crossing fees, which would mean a special assessment on all homeowners. Reroute all service vehicles through the main entrance, which would cost almost as much in the long run. Or fight your land claim in court." And they took a vote. Seems like they're going with option 3 for now. Marjorie was practically foaming at the mouth, according to Jerry. Said something about not giving in to rural extortion. Robert shook his head. All this fuss could have been avoided with a simple conversation months ago, before they'd blocked his eastern access. The next afternoon, a sleek black car with tinted windows pulled up Robert's driveway. A man in an expensive suit stepped out, briefcase in hand. He introduced himself as Jeffrey Powell, attorney for the Sycamore Hills Homeowners Association. Robert invited him in for coffee, which the lawyer accepted with surprise, clearly having expected hostility. "Mr. Caldwell," Powell began, setting down his cup, "I've been authorized by the board to discuss a possible resolution to our situation." "I'm listening," Robert said. "The association is prepared to offer you $10,000 for an easement across your newly acquired parcel. A fair price, well above market value." Robert took a slow sip of his coffee. "And my eastern access road?" Powell shifted uncomfortably. "The board maintains that's association property. However, as a gesture of goodwill, they might consider granting you limited access during certain hours. Limited access to a road I've used freely for 20 years. Robert's voice remained calm, but his eyes hardened. "While I grant full access to a road they've used for 3. Doesn't seem balanced, counselor. Mr. Caldwell, please understand the association's position. The Eastern Gate secures a residential area where families live. Your request involves children's safety. Funny how my cattle's safety wasn't a concern when they blocked my access during flood season," Robert replied. "Please thank the board for their offer, but I'm afraid I'll have to decline." Powell left with a tight smile and a promise to be in touch. Robert watched him go, wondering how long this standoff would continue. He didn't have to wait long for the next move. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived from Powell's law firm. It detailed the HOA's intent to sue for an easement by necessity, claiming the service road was essential for community operations and had been in established use since before Robert's purchase. Tom, Robert's lawyer, reviewed the letter and called with his assessment. "They're on shaky legal ground, Robert. They're arguing for an easement by prior use, but they'd have to prove that use predates your ownership of the parcel, which it doesn't. Plus, they have an alternative access route, even if it's less convenient. What about my eastern gate? Robert asked. Can we countersue on the same grounds? Already drafted the paperwork, Tom said with satisfaction. Your case is actually stronger. You can prove 20 years of continuous use, and during spring flooding you have no reasonable alternative. The local newspaper ran daily updates on what was becoming the biggest story in the county. Opinions were divided. Some folks sided with Robert, seeing him as standing up for traditional rural rights against encroaching suburbia. Others viewed him as an obstructionist, selfishly impeding progress. The practical effects became increasingly visible. Landscaping in Sycamore Hills fell weeks behind schedule. Plants withered in their plastic pots, waiting to be installed. The community pool renovation stalled when a cement truck couldn't navigate the narrow main entrance roads and had to be rescheduled at considerable expense. Robert continued his daily routine, tending to his springtime farm duties while watching the community's growing frustration. He took no joy in their difficulties but remained resolute. This wasn't about money. It was about respect and acknowledgement that long-established rights couldn't simply be erased by committee votes. Anonymous letters began appearing in his mailbox, some supporting him, others suggesting he wasn't being neighborly. A few local businesses dependent on Sycamore Hills residents for their livelihood began giving Robert the cold shoulder when he came to town. After 3 tense weeks, Robert received an unexpected visitor. A man in his 60s with salt and pepper hair knocked on his door one evening. He introduced himself as Victor Sanchez, a Sycamore Hills board member. I'm not here officially, Victor explained as they sat on Robert's porch, just as a concerned resident who thinks this situation has gotten out of hand. Unlike Marjorie's confrontational approach, Victor seemed genuinely interested in finding common ground. He asked thoughtful questions about Robert's ranch operation and listened carefully to the practical problems caused by losing the eastern access. The thing is, Victor said, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, most homeowners don't even know the full story. Marjorie presented it as the association defending itself against your unreasonable demands. Many weren't told about your 20 years of prior use or the spring flooding issues. That doesn't surprise me, Robert said. A group of us have been looking into the original development plans. Victor continued. Turns out the eastern access road was supposed to have a shared easement from the beginning. The developer intended for both properties to have legal access rights, but the paperwork was never properly filed before they went bankrupt. This was news to Robert. Can you prove that? Victor nodded, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. Original planning documents. Got them from county records yesterday. Robert studied the faded blueprint. Sure enough, a dotted line marked Shared Access Easement ran along his eastern border. Mr. Caldwell, Victor said quietly, I think there's a better solution than both sides paying lawyers and turning neighbors into enemies. If you're willing, I'd like to propose a compromise at next week's board meeting. But I'll need something from you first. What's that? A gesture of good faith. Open your gate for our emergency vehicles and critical maintenance for 1 week. Let me show the community you're reasonable. It'll strengthen my position with the board. Robert thought for a long moment, studying Victor's face for any sign of deception. Finding none, he nodded slowly. 1 week. Emergency and critical maintenance, only, and I want to be at that board meeting. They shook hands as the last light faded from the sky. The next morning, Robert unlocked his gate and posted a sign. Temporary emergency access only, by permission of property owner. Word spread quickly through Sycamore Hills. Some residents saw it as Robert backing down, but others, guided by Victor's quiet explanations, began to understand the bigger picture. 3 days later, as Robert was fixing a fence near his property, a small group of Sycamore Hills residents approached. They introduced themselves awkwardly, then thanked him for allowing the emergency access that had permitted repair of a broken water main. We didn't know about your eastern gate situation, one older woman admitted, or that you'd been using it for so long before our community existed. Most of us want to be good neighbors, another added. We just moved here for the schools and the nice homes. We don't want any trouble. Robert nodded, appreciating their honesty. I've lived here a long time. Don't mind sharing the land reasonably. Just need to be treated with the same respect I show others. As they walked away, Robert felt a slight shift in the atmosphere. Perhaps there was hope for a resolution after all. The following week, Robert put on his one good suit, tucked the original development plans Victor had given him into his pocket, and drove to the Sycamore Hills Community Center. The room fell silent as he entered and took a seat in the back row. Marjorie called the meeting to order, pointedly avoiding looking in Robert's direction. But when Victor stood to speak, Robert straightened in his chair, ready for whatever came next. The Sycamore Hills Community Center buzzed with tension. Every seat was taken and people lined the walls, some fanning themselves with meeting agendas in the stuffy room. Robert sat quietly in the back, drawing curious glances from residents who'd never seen him up close before. Marjorie rapped her gavel, calling the meeting to order. As you all know, we've gathered to address the ongoing access road situation with Mr. Caldwell. She nodded stiffly in Robert's direction. Our attorney has prepared several options for legal action, but Board Member Sanchez has requested time to present an alternative proposal. Victor stood smoothing his tie. Unlike Marjorie's rigid formality, he had an easy manner that seemed to relax the room slightly. Thanks, Marjorie. Folks, I've spent the past week looking into this situation, and I believe there's a better way forward than expensive legal battles that none of us can afford. He clicked a remote and an old property map appeared on the projector screen. This is the original development plan for Sycamore Hills, drawn up before construction began. He pointed to the eastern border. As you can see, this access road was originally designated as a shared easement between our community and the Caldwell Ranch. The developer intended both properties to have legal right of passage. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Marjorie leaned forward. That was never filed with the county. It's meaningless. True, Victor conceded. The developer went bankrupt before finalizing many aspects of the plan, but it shows intent, and it suggests a solution that honors the original vision for how our communities would coexist. He clicked to another slide showing a recent aerial photograph of both properties. Now, Mr. Caldwell has been using his eastern access for 20 years. We've been using the service road for 3. Both access points serve important functions for our respective properties. An older man in the front row raised his hand. What's your point, Victor? Are you suggesting we just let him charge us whatever he wants? I'm suggesting, Victor said calmly, that neither side wins if we dig in our heels. We need landscaping, trucks and service vehicles. Mr. Caldwell needs access during flood season. The sensible solution is a formal agreement that recognizes both needs. Marjorie crossed her arms. The board discussed this. Mr. Caldwell's demands are unreasonable. Victor smiled slightly. Actually, I took the liberty of discussing a potential compromise with Mr. Caldwell earlier this week. With the board's permission, I'd like to invite him to present it himself. All eyes turned to Robert. After a moment's hesitation, Marjorie nodded stiffly. Robert walked slowly to the front of the room, conscious of his worn boots and simple clothes amid the business casual attire of the HOA members. He hadn't prepared a speech, but as he faced the crowd, he knew honesty would serve him better than fancy words. I've lived on my ranch for nearly 20 years, he began, his voice quiet but clear. Seen a lot of changes in that time. When you folks started building here, I didn't object. There's room enough for all of us, I figured. He paused, looking around the room. What bothered me wasn't losing the use of a road. It was how it happened. No conversation, no warning, just a gate and a sign one morning as if my 20 years there meant nothing. Several residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I don't want to charge you folks for using that service road. Never did. That was just to make a point. Robert pulled a folded paper from his pocket, the original development plan Victor had given him. This here shows what should have happened. From the start, shared access recognizing that we're neighbors with shared interests in this land. He laid it on the table. So here's what I'm proposing. I'll grant an official easement for your service vehicles across my property at the southwest corner, free of charge. In return, you restore my access to the eastern gate, with a key card or whatever security system you need to feel comfortable. Marjorie started to object, but Victor raised a hand. Let him finish, please. I also think we should put together a simple written agreement. Robert continued, something that spells out property lines and access rights clear as day, so we don't end up back here again when board members change or I eventually sell my ranch. He looked around the room. That's it. No fees, no lawyers if we can avoid them. Just neighbors figuring out how to share the same piece of earth without getting in each other's way too much. For a moment, the room was silent. Then a woman in a floral blouse stood up. I've lived here 3 years, and I had no idea that gate had been your access point for so long. Why didn't anyone tell us this when the board decided to close it? All eyes turned to Marjorie, who straightened her papers without looking up. The board determined it was association property and acted accordingly. But was there any discussion with Mr. Caldwell first? The woman pressed. The legal ownership was clear, Marjorie responded. Another resident stood. I think Mr. Caldwell's proposal sounds reasonable, certainly cheaper than legal fees and all these extra costs we're paying for rerouted services. Heads nodded around the room. Victor seized the moment. I move that we accept Mr. Caldwell's proposal in principle and authorize the formation of a small committee to draft the formal agreement. Second, called several voices at once. Marjorie looked around the room, recognizing her position was weakening. Very well. All in favor? A forest of hands rose. Only Marjorie and 2 other board members abstained. Motion carries, she said tightly. As the meeting adjourned, several residents approached Robert, introducing themselves and asking questions about his ranch. One man apologized for the anonymous letter he'd sent. Another woman invited him to speak at her son's school about ranching life. Victor walked Robert to his truck. That went better than I expected, he said with a smile. Folks are generally reasonable when they have all the facts, Robert replied. Most problems between neighbors come from not talking enough. Over the next 2 weeks, a small committee with representatives from both sides hammered out the details. Tom, Robert's lawyer, drafted the official easement documents, carefully describing the access rights for both properties. The HOA's attorney, after some initial resistance, eventually agreed to the terms. On a warm morning in late May, Robert drove through his eastern gate for the first time in months. The HOA had replaced the solid barrier with a modern electronic gate, and Robert's new key card opened it smoothly. As he passed through, he noticed freshly planted flowers along the roadside, a small gesture of reconciliation from the landscaping committee. Later that same day, Robert stood at his property line watching as maintenance trucks used the service road, now properly marked with shared access easement signs. The drivers waved as they passed, and Robert waved back. That evening, as the sun set over his fields, Robert sat on his porch with a glass of iced tea. The past few months had been challenging, but something good had come from it. The easement agreement now filed with the county would protect both his interests and those of Sycamore Hills long into the future, regardless of who owned the properties. The following weekend, Sycamore Hills held their delayed community barbecue. To Robert's surprise, he received a formal invitation. He debated not going. Large social gatherings had never been his thing, but in the spirit of new beginnings, he decided to make an appearance. He arrived with several gallons of homemade ice cream from his dairy cows. The cold treat was an immediate hit with the children and adults alike. As he chatted with his new neighbors, he found most of them genuinely interested in his ranch and its history. As the evening wound down, Robert found himself face to face with Marjorie near the dessert table. She looked uncomfortable, but determined. I still think you were difficult about this whole situation, she said, her voice low so others couldn't hear. Robert scooped some ice cream into a bowl and handed it to her. Maybe so, and maybe you were too, but we got to the right place eventually. I was just trying to protect the community, she insisted. I understand that, Robert said sincerely. And I was trying to protect what's mine. Turns out we can do both at the same time. Marjorie tasted the ice cream reluctantly, then raised her eyebrows in surprise. This is actually quite good. Jersey cows, Robert explained. Been raising them for 15 years. A small silence fell between them, not entirely uncomfortable. I suppose, Marjorie said finally, that good fences do make good neighbors. Robert smiled, remembering an old saying his father had taught him. Sometimes good fences make good neighbors, Miss Whitfield, and sometimes knowing exactly where those fences stand makes for even better ones. He tipped his hat to her and walked back to his truck, the setting sun casting long shadows across both their properties, no longer divided by barriers of steel and pride, but joined by understanding and mutual respect. Not perfect, perhaps, but a start. And in the rural countryside where change came slowly and neighbors measured their relationships in decades rather than months, a start was all you really needed.